Welcome to the Midnight Vigil, the channel where the stars are always right and there really is a monster hiding underneath your bed. This is the fourth episode of Arcane Reference, my series where I discuss horror gems that went forgotten by the general public and didn't get the recognition I feel they deserved. Tonight I'll be discussing the video game Murdered Soul Suspect. As usual, I'll discuss the history of the game, give my impressions about it and why I think it deserves recognition, and finally discuss its overall legacy. Murdered Soul Suspect is a horror mystery game that has the player taking control of Ronan O'Connor, a detective with a checkered past who works for the Salem Police Department. The game immediately begins with Ronan being murdered, like the title suggests, while he's investigating a lead on the case the police have been struggling to solve, that of the Bell Killer, who gets his name from the bell-shaped symbol that he leaves as graffiti or on the victim at every crime scene. Gameplay is heavily influenced by Ronan's experiences from being a detective, so you'll be solving cases, investigating crime scenes, and speaking to witnesses. This in and of itself would be pretty unique because there aren't really enough detective games on the market. The biggest and maybe best examples are Heavy Rain and LA Noire, but what sets this apart from those titles is the key gameplay mechanic, the player being a ghost. So Ronan is murdered pretty brutally moments into the game, and he continues the rest of the game as a ghost, which lets him pass through walls, possess witnesses, which allows him to read and influence their minds, cause distractions in the environment using poltergeist abilities, and finally he can also possess the bodies of cats to do some light platforming. The story of Murdered has Ronan racing to solve his own murder and discover the identity of the Bell Killer before more innocent people are killed. Airtight Games, the developers of Murdered Soul Suspect, have a relatively short resume as game devs, though you've probably heard of a few of them. They have two games that I have heard of before I got around to finally playing Murdered, which are Dark Void and Quantum Conundrum. Airtight also made two iOS games, as well as one of the first announced exclusives for the Ouya console. So they have a pretty diverse library of games, and they've made a pretty diverse amount of games on different platforms as well. There's honestly not a whole lot that I can expand upon when it comes to Murdered's development history. With Alan Wake and Prey, two of my previous episodes, so much was known about the development and the production cycles of those games, so I had plenty of material to talk about. Here, not so much. All of the interesting discussion about the history of this game revolves around its publisher, Square Enix. Firstly, Square Enix, who are the publishers of this game, came to Airtight and asked them to develop a game around the concept that they came up with, that of the main character being a ghost. Square had apparently had the idea of this game for several years, but they didn't really know how to make an interesting game around the concept, so they brought it to Airtight, who they had a pretty good relationship with since they had previously published their game Quantum Conundrum. Surprisingly, Die Hard is mentioned as being a big inspiration behind the concept of the game. Yosuke Shiokawa, the creative director at Square, reflected on what would happen if John McClane had died during the events of Die Hard, expressing belief that his quest to save his wife wouldn't end even if he had to complete it in the afterlife. The last and, in my opinion, juiciest piece of information about the development and history of this game is that Square Enix chose this project specifically because they wanted to expand their market in the West. So, obviously, Square Enix are the mega successful developers and publishing studio behind Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Kingdom Hearts. Those games are obviously very successful, and they go on to sell millions of copies. And they are especially successful in the East, where Japanese gamers develop those kinds of titles. Later on in the video, I'm going to further unwrap Square Enix's involvement in this project, because their reason for why they were involved with this is interesting, and I feel like they kind of went about it the wrong way. But for now, let's move on to my impressions, and I'll tell you why I think this game deserves some recognition. So, my overall impressions, for starters, the gameplay here is really not that interesting. You will be doing a lot of the same things over and over again, and that can obviously be really repetitive, but the story is what makes this game worth checking out. If you are a big history buff and you're really into witchcraft, historically and fictionally, this is one of the rare games that explores and focuses on that aspect of the supernatural. And since this is set in Salem, the Salem witch trials are central to the story and gameplay. Since Ronan is a ghost and can walk through walls, there are times in the game where he suddenly can't do that. He can't pass through certain walls in the environment, and this gets explained away because the area he's in has been consecrated, so he has to find more creative ways to get through the environment. It's a pretty cool idea, but usually this just means that he has to wait for someone to walk through a door or open a window, and then he can get through. Gameplay-wise, that element is kind of boring and it's not really interesting, but I really like how they took, blessing environments and the holy water aspect and how they implemented that into the game. I thought that was pretty cool. Other gameplay quirks, well, there isn't any combat in this game, which I didn't know when I started playing it. Not a big deal, but just understand that you're essentially going to be playing a walking simulator. There's only one enemy type in the game, which is interesting because I just said there's no combat, so how in the world can there be enemies? Well, these enemies, called demons, are dispatched with a fairly clumsy QuickTime event, which gets old really fast. At the end of the game, I would encounter these enemies, and I would usually just see if I could run by them, because doing boring QTEs isn't fun at all. The cat platforming sections are pretty neat, but they're fairly small parts of the experience. You get to be a cat maybe 3 or 4 times in the game, and the only purpose this serves is to get through different areas that Ronan can't access himself. You will eventually get a power about halfway into the game, and yes, that is a power, as in a singular power, because that's all there is. There's only one power, and it allows you to teleport short distances. It's functional but uninspired, and really made me miss the excellent blink ability from Dishonored. This ability doesn't feel interesting or even necessary to the gameplay, because Ronan already has this ability to hide in pockets of ghost essence that are floating in the air, and this is really only used as a utility in case you mess up one of the demon QuickTime events and you have to hide in one of these pockets until they give up looking for you and go back to their usual search pattern. So Ronan can use these to move around other ghost pockets really quickly. You press a button and he just sort of teleports in between them. So early in the game, before Ronan has unlocked the teleport ability, you can actually use this ghost pocket to swap to another area that isn't accessible, in which a hidden collectible is hidden. I don't really understand why teleportation is even necessary to this game if there's already a system in place to solve this problem. If you want to hide stuff in the environment that players have to actively go looking for, I don't have a problem with that, but I don't really understand why we have this gameplay mechanic that is not interesting. You use it for one really short segment and then it's never necessary ever again. I don't really know. I don't know what the point of all this was. I'm kind of annoyed that there's only one power here, because again, this is a personal thing, but when I was getting into this game and I found out that you could be a ghost and that it was like a horror game, I couldn't help but immediately think of the cool possibilities for having supernatural powers and how that would play into combat. Obviously, I was wrong on both of those counts. The only real bone that I can throw Murdered here is that once you unlock the teleportation ability, you can then revisit old locations and access areas you weren't able to before. This works, but again, this is no Super Metroid here with multiple secrets to unlock and multiple powers and abilities to play around with. I thought the graphics were pretty good, but this is one of those weird games where the in-game cutscenes are noticeably uglier than the rest of the game. Also, the PC version has locked cutscenes to 30 frames per second, which disoriented me more than once since the actual game has a smooth and unlocked frame rate. There's also some annoying product placement for other Square Enix games, like Just Cause 2 and Deus Ex Human Revolution. These appeared frequently enough in-game and in places where I struggled to suspend my disbelief, like Deus Ex being on literally every single computer monitor inside the police station level. As to why they would even be there in the first place, I didn't really understand this. I got on to Alan Wake in my previous review for its product placement, and, at least Murdered isn't that bad. You only see Just Cause 2, you only see Deus Ex, you only see him a few times. This isn't as bad as Alan Wake, but it's still annoying. It seems like this is a pretty mixed bag, right? It's true that the gameplay here is really middle of the road, but why this is a recommendation for me is the great writing and story. The tone of Murdered is really dark, which makes it perfect as a horror-like game. The main character's wife has been dead for some time before the events of the story pick up, and we end up revisiting her murder and seeing what happened and how it negatively impacted Ronan's life. A lot of the game notes that you find and pick up are written from his wife's point of view, and they detail how they met and fell in love, so that really gives the game a tragic aspect. The antagonist, the Bell Killer, brutally dispatches their victims, and the game doesn't shy away from the details, which is pretty cool because you get to talk to some of the ghosts of these victims, and you walk them through their trauma as you try and deconstruct the crime scene and figure out what happened and why they were selected by the killer. Again, it's really cool to talk to people who have been murdered and figure out what's going on. There's not a whole lot of games, if there's any at all, that have explored this concept, and I had a lot of fun talking to different people because you get a lot of different point of views and you get a lot of different information, which is pretty unique. All of this ties in perfectly with the Salem witch trials, which really impressed me with how accurate and respectful the devs were of the source material. I always like games that mix real-world history in with their own blend of gameplay and storytelling, and Murdered is particularly great in this regard. Ronan encounters a lot of ghosts during his adventure in Salem, and they all have really tragic and really depressing backstories. Since the story of the main draw of this game, I'm going to read off a few of the encounters that left a lasting impression on me. The best one, the one that I'm still thinking about, is this ghost that you encounter in the cemetery section of the game. This ghost is a butcher who is haunting this woman, and he's right up in her face. You talk to him and you find out he was famous and he got all these awards and he was really successful, and people came from all over the area to eat the meats that he sold in his shop. Turns out the customer's son, the person that he's haunting, her son goes missing, and he was discovered in the butcher's shop. The butcher ends up being blamed, loses his business, and ends up getting put to death. What's really disturbing about this interaction with the butcher is that you find out that he fed her son to his pigs and then cut the pigs up and sold them to her and other people. He's not even remotely sorry, and the purpose for why he's haunting her is because he wants to make contact so that he can ask her how her son tasted. This is like crazy. This is I'm almost getting like Hannibal flashbacks here, which is incredible. But this just blew me away. It comes out of nowhere. You talk to this guy, he gives you this story. It's amazing. There's also a lot of suicide in this game, and all of these ghosts that you talk to, a whole bunch of them don't even know that they're dead. So again, there's another tragic element to that. You can talk with them and walk them through the events that led to their death and see if you can help them get the resolve they need to move on. So there's a really good connection here between how good the story is and how that directly plays into the gameplay. Another standout story is this ghost that you speak to in a church. And you find out that this guy is stalking his victim. He was stalking her when he was alive, and now that he's dead, he's still following her around. And he tells you his story. He ended up following her around everywhere, and while he was following her, he backed his car into a snowbank, and the exhaust backed up into the car, and he died. He's not sorry either, and says that being dead is the best thing that ever happened to him, because now he can follow her everywhere, and she can't get away, she can't escape, she can't fight back. It's just incredible when you see these stories. This is the kind of darkness, this is the kind of horror that I want from my games. The final standout that I want to go through, you talk to this ghost, a woman who killed herself because she believes that her fiance was cheating on her with this new woman that he has in his life. Turns out that she was paranoid and jumped off a cliff for nothing. He ended up loving her, and he ended up meeting the new girl that he's with currently because she reached out to him because he was dealing with the main girl's suicide poorly. So you end up helping her, but she gets no resolution. She gets nothing out of the process. She gets comforted, very little by what you end up talking to her with. This is the rare game, talking about things that I liked again. This is the rare game where I recommend you get as many of the collectibles as possible, because they serve the story and tone so well too. This isn't like the early Assassin's Creeds where you're running around collecting useless things. Like feathers, I'm specifically looking at you, Assassin's Creed 2. Every time you visit a new location, you can collect a certain amount of items that let you unlock a cutscene story that pertains to the environment and the objects you've collected. One location, the Asylum, had you finding ghostly straitjackets, and if you collected all of them, you get treated to this really creepy and atmospheric cutscene detailing a person who's come to the asylum because complaints have been made about patient abuse, and they're there to conduct an investigation. Turns out they're correct in their assumptions, and there's a lot of abuse going on at the asylum. Specifically, the main character of the cutscene discovers a patient that has been secluded in a broom closet for 15 years, chained to the walls, living in his own filth. The patient has been there so long that his sight is gone, his hair and his skin have turned white, and his skin has grown over and into the shackles he's been bound to the walls with. The asylum obviously gets in trouble, and the doctors get charged with a whole slew of crimes. So happy ending, right? Wrong. The victim in all this gets taken away to a hospital where emergency surgery is performed on him to remove the skin from the shackles and get it out of his body, and he ends up going into shock and dying. So once again, the tone here is really dark. All of these cutscenes are so detailed and so interesting. If you end up playing this game, you really owe it to yourself to see them all. I really felt immersed in the fiction of the game's universe, and all of these short scenes feel almost like short horror stories. That's how good the writing is. The running time is short, but I consider that a plus here. Murdered makes its point and gets out before it wears out its welcome. I got about 9 hours on my first playthrough, and I never felt bored or tired of the game. There's no replayability here, though, so once you've beaten it once, that's pretty much it. The final thing that I want to say as I wrap up this section is that I encountered a lot of odd bugs and glitches during my playthrough. Your mileage will vary, of course, but there was at least one serious bug in the church area that threatened to derail the whole experience and seemed game breaking. But I was able to eventually figure out a way to break the bug and get out of the situation. I also had some weird audio issues where the game audio would play through my headset, but the cutscenes and the dialogue were muted. I eventually solved this by disabling all other audio devices that were connected to my computer. All of this brings us to the conclusion of this video, the legacy section. As for the legacy of Murdered Soul Suspect, well, it's all pretty much bad news here. Murdered was released in 2014 to a poor to average critical response. The PC version currently has a 59 on Metacritic, and I can definitely see where many of the reviewers are coming from. The sales were similarly underwhelming, with VG charts estimating Murdered to have sold around 790,000 units on all platforms, over half of which came from the PlayStation platforms, and the worst is coming from the PC. Wolfenstein, Mario Kart 8, and Watch Dogs had launched in the previous weeks before this game came out, all of which I believe definitely helped Murdered fall way under the radar. Anecdotally, I don't remember a lot of press coverage or a lot of trailers before launch for this game, which may have also contributed to the underwhelming sales. Let's go back to that earlier statement we discussed in the intro to this video, the bit about Square Enix wanting to infiltrate the Western market. I don't really understand what they were thinking here. The horror genre is very niche, so if you were looking to make millions of sales from a horror game, you've just about set yourself up for disappointment. I also have to speculate on what Square wanted this game to hit, since there have been multiple stories in the past about them being disappointed in the sales of major franchises that managed to sell really, really well, but were still considered disappointments internally. We'll likely never know what Square wanted this game to hit as far as sales are concerned, but it's safe to say that 790,000 units is way off their projections. Even if that's a rough estimate, that's still horrible. There's also more bad news, because this was the last game that Airtight would make, as just 1 month after the release of Murdered came out, they would go on to permanently close their doors. So in conclusion, Murdered Soul Suspect was a project conceived of some interesting inspirations and had the backing of Square Enix, who desperately wanted a Western hit. With the sales and reviews being poor, it's not hard to see why Murdered is a game that went mostly ignored. They invested into the core idea of a game built around the main character being a ghost, a concept that I think Murdered handles really well. It earns a recommendation from me because of its strong horror storytelling and emphasis on historical events, namely the Salem witch trials. If you can forgive the average gameplay and get around its quirks, like glitches and bugs, I think it's well worth playing for its storytelling alone. I feel like the story and the tone are so good, they essentially earn this game a recommendation on their merits. So if you even have a passing interest in detective fiction and historical horror, you're likely going to find a lot to like here. That's pretty much it. I want to thank you guys for watching the video. If you are new here and you like what you've seen, feel free to subscribe. If you have a Twitter account, you can also follow me at Midnight Vigil. I'm really happy with where the channel's going. I feel like we've been growing a lot. I'm happy with how people have been responding. So I wanted to thank everyone for their early support. I know things are super rough now, but you know, all YouTube channels go through a rough growing pain period. So I'm pretty happy with how I've been progressing. But anyways, guys, that's pretty much it. Thank you, and I will see you next time.